The growth of European kingdoms. The objectives are: 1. Describe how European monarchs began to extend their power and build strong states during the High Middle Ages. And 2, identify the 3 distinct groups formed by the Slavic peoples and locate where they settled in Eastern Europe. Now, during the medieval period, England was a disparate, decentralized kingdom. Now, during the invasions of the Vikings, they began to unify together. The Anglo-Saxons unified under kings who led the banded tribes against these invading Norsemen. So really the Viking invasions that had disintegrated political authority in France and in Europe proper really bound together England. And so you see a trajectory toward unification in England as a result of the invasions of the Vikings. Now, one of the great kings that emerged from this is the famous King Alfred the Great, whom really led England into this unified period of history against the Vikings. Now, inevitably over time, this unification of England was not long-lived. It was in 1066 that an army of heavily armed knights under William of Normandy, whom landed in England, he defeated the English king at the Battle of Hastings, and ultimately defeats the indigenous kings in England at the time. Now, William, along with other kings, had a claim to the throne. The king who had been next in line had no sons, and inevitably then it led to a massive war. Now, William of Normandy then is the ultimate victor in this situation, and he himself is French-speaking, has a very French way about him, particularly when it comes to cultural and political traditions. England had been developing its own sort of identity, influenced from ancient Anglo-Saxon tradition and Viking, Norman, and other territories in the north. They had their own political and cultural identity, which had a deep root in decentralization that became centralized. But when William of Normandy invades and conquers, he brings with him not just French-speaking culture, but feudalism itself and the old political feudal structures. And so you end up seeing in England an intermarriage, a mingling between the two cultures, medieval England and medieval France and Europe proper. And one of the first notable things is the political structure gets an overhaul, and particularly taxation. So there is the existing Anglo-Saxon institutions. For example, each individual territory was called a shire, and in this shire there was a person who was in charge of the maintenance of the laws and making sure that people are obeying, and that was called a reeve. And so a shire reeve is a person who is in charge of that territory. Now you could see the English derivative coming from this. Shire reeve, sheriff emerges out of this. And really that idea of a sheriff, of a person in charge of a parcel of land to make sure that people are obeying the law is an English idea. Now, inevitably, what William asks and what the new government creates is a means by which to understand and check each individual territory, to understand what the assets are. He wants to know what he owns. I mean, he conquered this territory, and so he wants a better idea of how it functions and how to tax it. And so he has domesday books created. Now, dome, as in not doom, is or in some sense doom. It's a domicile. It comes from the Latin word home. It's to measure what assets and people exist within his territory. So it's a census, which included people, manors, farm animals. It included everything. And so each different shire had to have a domesday census done against it to show what's going on. This, of course, is to have a better way of taxing. And inevitably then, he brings feudalism to these territories. He invests power into a knight, into a lord, for that territory, for that sheriff, for that shire, and then gives authority for its maintenance and taxation. So here we can see in the background a actual page from Warwickshire from the Domesday Book. So taking a look then. So Warwickshire, it has a listing of all the different territories. If we go down, we can see some of the other items being listed. So you can see the names of the tenants and the territories here on the left. And so these are all the people that live in those different areas, and they have different lands. And so the whole idea is getting a sense of who owns what, how much they have, so you can tax them. Now, over time, then, this monarchy was solidifying power. And really, this new solidification ends up hitting the next major point under Henry II. So the power of the English monarchy was enlarged during the reign of Henry II, whom reigned from 1154 to 1189. Now, one of the major ideas that he fashions is a common law. It's a law that would be common to all Englishmen, all of England itself, fashioned by the king. So the law was common to the whole kingdom, which again is a centralization, not a decentralization. And this is a trend that is existing and going on in England, where they're trying to centralize the experience, the law, the rule, all underneath the power of the king. Now, of course, there are plenty of forces that would like to keep it decentralized. For example, a particular lord in a region who wants to be independent would want decentralization. That means that the king wouldn't be up in his business, but that he would be able to be autonomous and independent without the king looking over his shoulder. Now, the king doesn't want that. The king wants complete and total control. He wants all that money to come to him. Now, Henry ended up imposing royal control over the church in England as well. He wants to control every aspect of the society. And particularly one of the major issues is that he wants to be able to punish clergymen. Now, how it existed before in the medieval period was that the church punished church members, and the lord or king punished his own knights and his own people. So in a certain sense, there was an idea that the bishops and the clergymen weren't actually his subjects, but the Pope's subjects. Now, Henry's not going to like this, nor are many kings at all. Particularly, he wants the right to be able to punish a clergyman if he commits a crime. Now, he wants to reform the church such that it becomes more English-focused. That is, a church that is subservient in some sense to his own wishes. Now, to do this, he appoints one of his friends to the archbishopric in Canterbury, and this person's name was Thomas à Becket. Now, this archbishop then would, of course, be his man, at least he thought. Now, the archbishop claimed that only Roman Catholic courts could try clerics. He pulls a 180 on him, completely turns it around. Now, of course, in frustration, Henry cries out, "Who will free me of this priest?" Now, his knights in the room thought he was serious, and so they march over to the cathedral in Canterbury, and they bash his head open with their swords and fling his brains on the altar. And so this becomes a famous moment in the conflict between the Catholic Church and the Crown for competing authority, which is a trend that will exist in the rest of medieval history as the two powers are competing and butting heads against one another. Now, the overall narrative and trend of the monarchs trying to gain power hits a new high under the reign of King John. Now, many resented the growing growth of this king's power. And, of course, many nobles and many peasants under those nobles are striving for rebellion. Rebellion seemed inevitable. And, in fact, a rebellion did break out. And in 1215, really, the nobles ended up, through this rebellion, kidnapping King John and forced him to sign a contract called the Magna Carta, that is, the Great Charter. Now, a charter is a contract, and it essentially said that the nobles had their own autonomy and were not 100% subservient to the king. And so this document, while King John, of course, signed under duress and, in fact, did everything he could to dissolve such a document, was a turning point in the idea of nobility and kingship. It put a nail into the coffin of the idea of absolute authority in the English political system. Now, this, of course, idea will dominate in other territories in Europe, but what we end up seeing is that the people want a limited monarch, and the monarch, of course, wants total control. And so this conflict between centralization and decentralization continues to tug back and forth. Now, ultimately, the belief that the feudal custom and obligation is mutual was one of the key ideas of this document, that the king had to do his part too. He couldn't just completely control the nobles, and that the nobles just had to obey blindly. So ultimately, the goal was that it led to a limitation of absolute power, led to the limitation of the power of the king. Now, in the 13th century, Edward the First created the English Parliament, which is, again, another major shift. Now, the idea of a parliament, that is, representatives from England itself and all over the territory, whom would assist and help vote and run things with the king, really composed of 2 knights from every county and 2 from every town, along with all the nobles and bishops. So all these people supposedly represented the people. Now, to some extent, they really represent the wealthy, not the poor. That's important to make a distinction. This is not democracy in any true sense. These people represent the interests of the wealthy elite in their territories. And this parliament, while not truly democratic in a true sense, is turning the gaze toward a representative government that will inevitably begin to emerge in England, which is completely different than what we see in other territories. Now, leaving England, focusing on France, last we saw that the Carolingian Empire had really been disintegrated, divided into 3 major sections. And this, of course, occurred in 843, precipitated not only by the death of Charlemagne, but also the invasions from the Vikings, Magyars, and Muslims. Now, the West Frankish nobles chose Hugh Capet as the new king, and thus really establishing a new dynasty, the Capetian dynasty of the French kings. But this was the most western portion, and so this becomes what we'll end up calling France. That central and eastern portion will have a different identity through time. But under this new dynasty, the royal domain centered around a new urban center, Paris, which had really existed before, but really becomes the locus of power, the center of power for this new dynasty, this new French monarchy, which really emerges out of the ashes of the Carolingian Empire. Now, the reign of King Philip II of Augustus, in that same line, from 1180 to 1223, is really representative of the new power that's arising in this Western Frankish kingdom, the French kingdom. So he waged war against the rulers of England, who also ruled French territories of Normandy, Maine, Anjou, and Aquitaine. And England and France are going to have a bitter, long battle and conflict over the centuries, particularly over the land that existed between the two. And Philip really seizes back all these lands that were near their territory and are able then to create a new trajectory for the French kingdom, France that we might be familiar with. And so the French and the English are now back and forth fighting for these same territories. And Philip II is a great, powerful response to the rise of a strong England. Now, Philip IV, often referred to as Philip the Fair, whom reigned from 1285 to 1314, really strengthened the French monarchy, not just politically, like we saw in the last monarch, but expanded the monarchy in the sense of expanding the royal bureaucracy, expanding the governmental structure. And so he formed a French parliament, just like his English counterpart, and really based this structure off the three key estates, or what we might call classes of France. That is, you have three key groups. You have the clergy, right, the parts of religious structure and order. You have the nobles, knights and lords, and you have the peasants, which were, of course, farmers and things like that. But the kind of peasants we're probably going to talk about that are related into this governmental structure are merchants, wealthy merchants that are beginning to emerge as a result of trade. And so we see that these three distinct groups are represented within the French Parliament, which again is a new trend emerging. Now, leaving England and France aside then, we need to look at the Holy Roman Empire. Now, of course, remember that the Carolingian Empire disintegrated, collapsed, and that western portion that we saw becomes France as we know it. But the eastern portion of the Frankish kingdom really ends up becoming a proto-Germany. It's not Germany. There's no centralized Germany, but we are going to see a German language, a German dialect, a German medieval culture begin to emerge in this Eastern Frankish kingdom. And so these dukes that reigned in that Eastern kingdom begin to solidify a new kingdom that we might call Germany. But it's really called the Holy Roman Empire. Why? Because one of the major things that we can remember from the Carolingian Empire is that Charlemagne was crowned Roman Emperor. Now, where did that Roman Emperor title go? It didn't go to the Western French. It went to the Eastern French, the Eastern Frankish kingdom. And so the kings of the eastern portion would end up having this title, Roman Emperor. Now, it becomes called the Holy Roman Emperor in the Holy Roman Empire because it's not really Roman in a true sense. It's coming from the papal, Pope, Catholic Church control and authority. So the Holy Roman Empire. So Otto I is crowned Emperor of the Romans in 962. He is the representative of this trajectory of the Eastern Frankish kingdom. And so he becomes that proto-German king, Otto I. And he is then the first Holy Roman Emperor, separate from the Carolingian Empire. And so we see various struggles, of course, as well for control between the Holy Roman Empire and Italy, which is going to be a major theme throughout the rest of European history. Particularly, we could see this under the King Frederick the First. He planned to get his chief revenue from Italy. They in the East are going to be very, very decentralized as a result of the Magyar invasions right in their own backyard. Now, as the Roman emperor, he believed that he should rule Italy as the Romans had. of course, this concept that was given to them by the Pope is going to, of course, cause problems, because this seems like a natural idea that being the Roman emperor, he should be in charge of Rome. So he attempted to conquer the Italian states, bringing his Germanic tribes, right, that Eastern Frankish kingdom, down into conquest. And so he attempts to conquer the Italian states, but was held back by the Papal States and his alliance. So the Pope is able to push back on Frederick the First and resist by banning the Papal States and the territory together. Now, of course, this isn't going to be the trend forever. They're not going to be able to resist for long. But this introduces a major conflict that will exist throughout medieval history and European history in general, is the kind of ambiguous relationship that emerges between the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy. And also, in general, a conflict and ambiguous identity between European kings in general and the Pope and the Roman Empire. Now, the effect on the empire, by spending their time fighting in Italy, as a result of Frederick's desire to gain more revenue in Italy, what ends up happening is that the German Empire left the nobles to gather strength and create independent kingdoms. The irony here is that Frederick the First went to Italy to solidify his power, and as a result of greedily going down to solidify his power more in Italy, he ends up decentralizing it more because he's absentee, right? He's not home. He's not there to keep the nobility in check. And so the nobles gain power, they gain strength, and they end up fracturing off of that kingdom and creating their own tiny islands of power, their own tiny parcels of land that are completely independent, for the most part, to the king. And so this trend leads to a very decentralized Holy Roman Emperor. All of a sudden you have these nobles who, in effect, act like kings and have the authority of kings, but they themselves are subservient to the Holy Roman Emperor. So we end up seeing this emperor ruling over various kingdoms ruled by independent kings. So there was no real power in either Germany or Italy, no central authority. And so what we're going to see is, if we look eastward, decentralized, fractured kingdoms, and as we move to the center of Europe, France, and moving that way, we're going to see centralization. And then we go to England, which is somewhat centralized, but has a tendency toward decentralization. They have that conflict going on between the two. Now, if we go even further east, what are we talking about in Central and Eastern Europe? Remember, these are the territories that the Magyars had been sitting, and there was no real authority. The Carolingian Empire had never really dominated in that area. Now, there was a group of people called the Slavic people. They had settled in the north of Constantinople. And they were really divided into three distinct groups with all the same real ethnicity. The Western Slavics, Southern, and Eastern Slavics. Now, in the West, a group emerged, the Czechs, and these Czech people in the West converted to Christianity, particularly to Roman Catholicism in the long run. Why? Because they're closest to the Roman papacy. Now, the Hungarians in the north all accepted Western Christianity as well. So it seemed that the Hungarians, the Czechs, and anyone close in proximity to that region is going to maybe make a greater connection to the Italian Roman Catholicism. But of course, the Eastern Orthodox, the Eastern Christians are also going to want to have some strong influence on these people. So the Southern Slavs ended up converting to Orthodox Christianity, really as a result of two Byzantine missionaries, their brothers, Cyril and Methodius, These two brothers, having retranslated some works into these people's own languages, ends up making a dramatic shift and a dramatic influence into these people's lives. The Slavs, Croats, Serbs, the Czechs, the Hungarians, the Bulgarians, all formed different types of Christian communities in Eastern Europe. Again, decentralization. No centralized ethnicity, no centralized form of Christianity. So we have a very decentralized trajectory of these cultures. Now, of course, what is in common, though, is that they are converting to Christianity. They're starting to have written languages. They're starting to have a blend between Western, as it's emerging, political structures, but again, keeping much of their own indigenous identities as well. Now, if we go further north, we also see Russia beginning to emerge. Really, in the late 8th century, we saw Swedish Vikings. They moved into the lands of the northern territories, and they had done so to trade and to plunder the territory, to trade and plunder various churches and lands. Now, inevitably, they ended up settling in these territories, and the natives ended up calling these Vikings the Rus. Now, the Rus, as they end up settling and building cities and developing, leads to what this territory will end up being called Russia or Russia. And that's how we get the term Russia from the Viking indigenous people that end up settling there, the Rus. And so the Russian identity ends up being very influenced by the Viking Nordic traditions. Now, one of the major cities that ends up first emerging is Kiev. And this was really set up by and conquered by and controlled by Oleg. Oleg, a 10th century Viking leader, settled in this city, Kiev. And they gradually expanded their territory to the Baltic, to the Black Sea, to the Danube, to the Volga River, growing their territory, growing their political authority, maintaining that Viking tradition deep within its DNA. Now, of course, it won't be the same in terms of the old Viking ways that we see in other territories, but this will have a strong influence on their future identity, because these Vikings intermarry with the indigenous Slavs that we just saw. These Slavic people who had been converting to Orthodox Christianity are going to mix, and so the two become one in Russia. It has a Slavic identity, and it has a Viking identity. And so they eventually convert to Eastern Orthodox Christianity through their wives and through missionaries. And so these Vikings become what we might call a Proto-Russian, something we might be more familiar with. Now, civil wars inevitably emerged, and new invasions brought an end to the first Russian state in 1169. But this major shift ends up creating a new identity for Russia as things begin to emerge. But it's really in the 13th century that we see Mongols conquer this first emerging Russia, and they really required the Russian princes to pay tribute to them, no centralized authority. The Mongols will try to control the territory, but only from a distance. It's really only through the efforts of Alexander Nevsky, a prince of Novgorod, that defeated a German invading army into Russia in 1242, that so impressed the Mongols that as a reward he was given the title Prince from the Mongols, who later became the leaders of Russia in the long run. The objectives were: 1. Describe how European monarchs began to extend their power and build strong states during the High Middle Ages. And 2, identify the 3 distinct groups formed by the Slav peoples and locate where they settled in Eastern Europe.